So John Bell will be going first today in this session. And he farms with his extended family at Elmwood Stock Farm in Scott County. It's a certified organic 550-acre farm. Elmwood produces a diversity of produce and livestock, the majority of which are sold directly to the local community. John oversees the crop, cattle, and pickup production, as well as the extensive rotations, cover crops, and grazing central to Elmwood's fertility and soil building program. John has been a member of Oaks since its inception and is currently chair of Oaks Board of Directors. Thanks for being here with us, John. Krista will present the second part of the session, and Krista Jacobsen is a faculty member at the UK Horticulture Department and is an agroecologist by training. Her work in organic farming systems focuses on soil health, cover crops, and other soil conservation practices in vegetable production systems. She directs the UK Sustainable Agriculture and Community Food Systems undergraduate program and is the faculty chair of UK's Local Food Systems Institute, the Food Connection. So thank you both for being here. And I'm gonna turn over the screen share to John.
Thank you, Brooke. So thank you, Brooke, for that introduction. First, as an attendee of this conference, so I've been watching quite a few sessions over the last 3 days. I want to publicly thank Brooke and compliment her and applaud her for the wonderful job she's done. She's an amazing multitasker, moderating all these sessions in a very skillful manner between keeping us on task and going through the questions, moderating, and troubleshooting technology. So I think Brooke's done an amazing job, and I just want to publicly thank her. And then a little less visible, more behind the scenes, Jenny, Robin, and Katie have done a great job keeping the trains running on time, so to speak, keep getting the speakers lined up. And their responses and activity in the chat room is amazing. There's often links being brought up in the chat room before the speaker even finishes completing the sentence involving that link. So if we were in an auditorium right now, you guys would be getting a standing ovation. So I want to thank you guys for the great job you've done. So now about our talk. Elmwood has been the lucky recipient of several different research projects with Krista Dr. Krista Jacobsen at UK and some of her grad students over the last few years. And so there's some take-home messages. There's a lot we can learn from Krista. And it's kind of applicable to soils in general, and then our farm soils in Central Kentucky. So myself included, I look forward to some of the take-home messages that she can give us that are both applicable to existing long-term farmers such as myself, and beginning farmers when you're thinking about the system that you want to try to follow as you're putting together your system if you're a new farmer, beginning farmer. So basically, to set her up so some of her discussion makes sense, I'm kind of going first to describe the Elmwood system and the Elmwood process that we do here, since that's she's been researching. So first off, then we'll talk about Elmwood. It's 550 acres, Central Kentucky, as Brooke said. Of that 550 acres, 200 acres are tillable. And what I mean by that is 200 acres lay flat enough that, we're a very rolling Central Kentucky bluegrass region farm, but there's approximately 200 acres that's flat enough in small parcels that we can till it and crop it. So 550 total acres, 200 acres are tillable. Of that 200 tillable acres, we only till or crop about 75 acres each year. A little under half of that's usually in grain production for the poultry and the pig operation. And a little over half of that is vegetables, produce that we sell to the local communities. So we're been certified organic since 2000. And our fundamental farming practice of rotating crops with livestock has been going on for several generations. And so that's the practice that we're probably here to talk about. It's kind of what a lot of Krista's research in soil building and energy consumption has revolved around. So what I mean by that crop rotation with livestock is back to that 200 tillable acres. My grandfather taught my father, which taught my sister and I, that just because you can crop all 200 acres doesn't mean you should. You have to take care of your farm. You have to take care of the soil. And to do that, we only harvest, we only make it work. We only mine it for nutrients by cropping it, a cash crop, for a few years, and then we have to let it rest, rejuvenate, rebuild. And that's where the livestock come in. So the rotation that we've been using, some form of this rotation for several generations. So of this 550 acres, a portion of it has been farmed by my family. We've been fortunate enough to steward the land for nearly 100 years now. So we have a little experience with how this rotation has impacted the land just over a long-term study by doing it. So of that 550 acres, the 200 acres on the right is the quote cropland. So that leaves 350 acres that's in permanent pasture. It's some a little bit wooded, but it's mostly hills, meadows, and then a perennial grass and legume crops. So the rotation is, of that 200 acres, every year we crop 75 acres. So each year we will till up 25 acres of sod and put it back into row crop production. And then we also are sowing down 25 acres that has been cropped for 3 years. We're sowing it back down and putting it back into the rest period. We usually sow it down with grass and clover or grass and alfalfa. And then there's always quite a few weeds that grow as well and other things that we don't sow. And as far as grazing it, we get to call those forbs and stuff like that. But when it's in the vegetable production, then they're weeds. But so every year we plow 25 acres and sow 25 acres down. Plow 25 acres, sow 25 acres down. So that's our rotation. So for 3 years, we're cropping the cropland, and then it rests for 5 years in a permanent pasture. It seems to be working, but does it? So the seems to be working part is we've been doing some of this land this way for nearly 100 years. And we can still, to this day, when we plow that sod, that first crop that comes off of it with virtually no inputs, is still a very vibrant, very healthy, very productive crop, just like it was 25, 50, 75 years ago for my grandfather. So clearly, at least from our experience perspective, we're not depleting the soil or hurting the soil or wearing it out. After that break, our crops are just as healthy, just as vibrant and aggressive as they were generations ago. But that's still just kind of our experience or our qualitative opinion, I guess. So the other thing that we as farmers, the simple thing we can do is look at soil test. And the soil test from the 1970s through the 1980s to the 1990s into the 2000s all looked very similar. Organic matter, mineral balancing, with only a small amount of fertilizer, and we can talk about that in a while, but we only apply a small amount of mineral balancing fertilizer. We do very little fertilizer applications to feed the crops themselves. But the soil test over the years, over generations, have pretty much remained the same. So we feel like the system's working with our experience on what little numeric metric we can look at, which is a soil test. But to get a better understanding, are we actually really not taking slow steps backwards? So we feel like we're rebuilding the soil with that rest period. So that's 3 or 4 steps forward in soil rebuilding, but are we taking 2 steps backwards or 4 steps backwards when we till it up and crop it? And so it seems like it's pretty much holding its own or maybe improving slightly. Dr. Krista Jacobsen and a grad student did a study. One of the studies they did was on what's happening during this 5-year rest rejuvenation period to try to see, in the net long run, are we slowly mining the soil? Or are we kind of maintaining it, or are we improving the soil? So what they did, those 5 years of rest, they took soil samples 4 times a year, and they did this test 2 or 3 years. But they would come out 4 times a year and take soil samples from that field that just came out of row crop production. So we call it year 1 because that's the first year of rest. But they take it from the second, third, fourth, and then that field that's in its last year of rejuvenation, rebuilding phase of pasture, right before it gets tilled and taken back into crop production, that would be the 5th year. So they took soil samples from all 5 rebuilding phases, and then the control was a perennial pasture of similar soil type, a few hundred feet actually from one of these crop fields, but similar soil. But it was in an area that was either too small or too hilly to actually crop, so it never was tilled. It was part of that 350 acres of permanent pasture. So the soil samples from there, that's never tilled, never disturbed, and just grazed, that was the control. And so Krista can give a much better explanation of what happened than what I'm doing. But the high point is they looked at organic matter in the soil, carbon and nitrogen in the soil, and biological activity, numbers and activity. And what they saw was there was clearly a large depletion of all of those after 3 years of cropping. So that first year of rebuilding, the organic matter was down, the carbon and nitrogen in the soil was down, and the biological activity, the biology numbers were less than the control. But all 3 of those categories, nutrients, organic matter, and biology, all kind of rejuvenated and did rebuild through that rest period. And those categories were basically by the year 4 or 5 becoming equal to or similar to the control. So basically we felt like her research kind of backed up what our experience was, that 5 years of rest was at least keeping us from going backwards or slowly wearing our soils out. So what's happening? What do I think's going on? What's happening? And it's simply put, it's just that living root that's in the soil for 5 straight years, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year. For 5 years, there's a living root in the soil. It's growing, it's adding organic matter, it's shedding its skin, it's so that way also if it was to die, break off, it still is adding organic matter, it's making channels in the soil. But also it's the delivery system of a bunch of energy, a bunch of captured sunlight through the form of sugar or exudates that it feeds the biology in the soil. So as the roots are in the soil, physically changing the structure of the soil and also feeding the biology and not being interrupted, not having that relationship destroyed for 5 straight years is a big chunk, or I feel like a majority of the soil building, rebuilding, resting process is that living root in the soil for such a long extended time. Then the herding ruminants offer benefits to that. Besides the living roots are doing the work, but the herding ruminants kind of make that happen. So first off, economically, so the way I can afford to rest my soils for 5 years and not sell cash crops off of it is grazing these ruminants. So ruminants specifically, there's other animals that are foragers, but ruminants specifically, with that vat of a stomach they have that allows them to digest all that cellulose and turn it into weight gain and body weight. They're the most efficient utilizers of the above ground forage that are able to gain weight and turn that into money for me. So economically, ruminants allow me to be able to rest that soil, but still make a little bit of money each year while it's resting, while it's rebuilding. And then mechanically, they help the rebuilding process. We've all read about or actually experienced trying to rebuild your soils with high biomass multi-species cover crop. And you grow a bunch of tonnage of stuff, but to get it in contact with the soil surface, you have to flail mow it and maybe lightly incorporate it some to get it in contact with the soil surface so it can be incorporated in the soil to help build the soil. So I feel like that biomass growing is 2 steps forward, but then the physical incorporation is maybe 1 step backwards. So I like to think of the grazing ruminants is 2 steps forward and no steps backwards, because every time they take a bite of food and poop it out the back, basically they've done a quick compost and they're putting that biomass that we don't have to flail mow and incorporate. They're by digesting it, they're putting it in contact with the soil surface in a fairly stable form that allows the digesters in the soil break it down and incorporate it into the soil. So their physical eating of that and recycling it and putting it in contact with the soil surface has helped to build the soil, because besides the root, that gets the forage above ground in contact with the soil. And then they can actually manage in a certain manner using electric fences or poly netting, whether it's sheep or cattle, managed in a certain way. What I mean by that is high biomass, high activity for a very brief period, and the long recovery. You can actually speed up this rebuilding process. And this is, we kind of implemented this in the last few years. And I feel like instead of maybe holding our own, we're not mining the soil, kind of a flat line, I feel like we're actually starting to improve the soil. So some people call this mob grazing, and we can talk about it more detail later. And I'm sure Mrs. Flack this afternoon will be talking about it, or at the round table later on, we can talk about it. But the crux of it is if you force your cattle to, what we're seeing on the slide right there, the cattle have a brief but a very intensive experience on a very grown or mature forage. They either poop or trample all of that down into the soil surface, puts it in contact with the soil surface to decompose, and then there's a long rest and recovery period there. So that's what I feel like is the maybe the most efficient soil building process with the livestock. So with that rotation in mind, the 3 years of crops and utilizing livestock, how do we take advantage of this, or how does it work specifically at Elmwood? So first off, our rotation cash cropping system. As I mentioned before, when you plow that sod, there's a huge nutrient release. That soil has rested, and there's tons, you introduce that oxygen in there, there's tons of biology, and just there's an explosion of nutrients. So that first year is when we grow our highest value, highest nutrient demanding crops. So think of tomatoes or peppers or sweet corn, squash, maybe potatoes. And on the grain side, that's usually where we go with our corn crop in that first year. Then the second year of the rotation, there's not quite as many nutrients out there. And so on the grain crop, that's usually where we go with soybeans. And on the cash crop, basically because of the convenience of we've grew those tomatoes late up into the fall, put in a cover crop, but it's usually not too big in spring. That second year is often where we go with our spring and fall cool season transplants, greens, lettuces, carrots, that kind of stuff. But then the third year, we're seeing that the soil, the fertility, the nutrients are really played out. And so quite often we do the legumes in that third year. So think of dry beans, snap beans, peas. And then on the grain side, we did corn the first year, soybeans the second year. Then the third year is small grain that is basically feeding off of some of the residual nitrogen left from the soybean crop. So that's our cropping rotation, high nutrient demanding first year, and then crops. Sweet potatoes is another one, low nutrient demanding crops. So we usually grow sweet potatoes in that third year soil, and a lot of legumes, because they can kind of, they're not very high nutrient demanding except for nitrogen, and with nitrogen, their relationship with the rhizobia, they can fix their own nitrogen and actually maybe start the rebuilding process. So value add. The next thing is we try to add value. We sell a whole lot of retail stuff. Instead of selling grain, we prefer to sell proteins, chickens, eggs, pork, turkey. Literally, the fewer pounds of stuff that leave your farm, that's that much less stuff that you either have to regenerate on your farm or buy and haul in off the farm. So the more value you can add, the less stuff that leaves, the less stuff you have to recreate, rebuild, replace. And then because if you remember our farm, we have 350 acres. It's in permanent pasture. All it does is just get grazed and become more and more fertile because we can't crop it. What we do is we take our hay off of that land, but the only place we feed hay to the cattle is on the cropland, the future cropland, somewhere in that 200-acre rotation. So the 350 rolling acres, it does have to help the cropland work a little bit. We take the hay off of the rolling land, we feed it on the cropland. So anything that the cows don't eat becomes more organic matter, more thatch, more cover crop, or more cover on the ground and soil to be decomposed and turned into the soil. And a big chunk of what the cattle do eat, they just poop out the back right there where they ate. And so that is a way we are moving nutrients around on our farm. We try not to have to buy too many nutrients and bring in on the farm, but we do try to move nutrients around the farm. And then finally, we just kind of the main point of this, we graze ruminants. Basically, the ruminants grazing on this resting land makes us a few $100s an acre in the weight they gain while they're grazing that. So the ruminants are paying us to not have to buy fertilizer. What we don't do, we don't sell hay. So there's several studies out there. The quickest one I found was by Dr. John Leroy at University of Missouri. And what it is if you have an acre of standing forage, say 3 tons of alfalfa and grass, knee high in a pasture, what happens if you remove that by grazing it and walking it off in the forms of a few pounds gain on an animal, or cut it for hay and sell the hay? If you graze that, so if you think about it, when an animal eats forage and then tramples in what it doesn't eat, all that tons of green biomass that was above the earth, up in the air, above that field, above that soil, other than the body heat that they have generated and the weight that they gained, the rest of that is all captured and is now on the soil surface to be decomposed and turned into soil. On the other hand, if you haul it off in hay, you're hauling off 6 times more phosphorus, 15 times more nitrogen, and 150 times more potassium than by grazing it and walking a few pounds of weight gain off. We don't buy much fertilizer. If we have to buy something, we prefer to buy feed or hay because you kind of get double duty there. If you do buy feed or hay, you feed your livestock and then they get gain out of it. And then what either they don't eat, what they spill, and what they digest and poop, that basically then becomes fertilizer. So we try not to have to buy very little of anything, but if we do, we prefer to buy feed. And so kind of a short story there is several years we had excess grain that for the poultry operation, and we sold it in the organic market, and it was nice income source. But after doing that a couple of years, that was one more reason for us to start getting into hog production. So in the last couple of years, we've actually been a little bit short on grain. And so we've been buying feed, and the point being, I'd much rather be buying a little bit of feed because I haven't quite grown enough for my poultry and hogs than I would be selling the grain, because I'd rather bring somebody else's fertility and nutrients onto my farm than me shipping mine off the farm. So why I think this works. It's not really just my cattle are being my manure spreaders for me. It's not that simple. It's not just I'm using animal manure to fertilize the field. It's actually the mechanical work they do of incorporating all that green forage and putting it on the soil surface through eating and trampling. And then also, kind of back on that mob grazing, we're using the herding instinct of those ruminants. Once they're trained and you're moving them daily and they go from a well-soiled, well-trampled, well-digested pasture and every day onto a fresh one, they don't do a lot of picking. You take the hot wire up, they immediately start eating like a mob of cattle. That's why it's called mob grazing. But that has a huge impact, and they basically harvest and trample that entire biomass quickly in a 24-hour period, and then they move on to the next place. So you're kind of using their herding instinct to your advantage. Biological and economical diversity. So besides us selling it's an income source, just produce. We're also selling meat, proteins. So that's the economical diversity. And then the ruminants are adding to the biological. They are biology themselves, but a great way to rebuild or restore a depleted field or a newly rented field is to graze animals on it, because their biota themselves is more diversity. They're inoculating the soil with more biology than you can add just with a compost or with a compost tea spray. Their biome themselves, every time they poop, they're inoculating the soil. Simply put, grazing ruminants reduces the cost of resting and rebuilding fields with perennials and can speed the process. I think it's about time for me to switch. I'll hit this real quick and then I'll give it up. 3 areas that it's kind of relevant to some of what Krista might be talking about. But where we are right now is because that 3rd year of cropland is a little bit depleted in nutrients, and also to help break up some weed cycles, we're experimenting with, out of that, increasing that 3 years of cropland to 4 years of cropland, but putting some in the middle of that, not a cash crop, but multi-species, high population, high volume cover crops to kind of rest, rebuild the soil for 4, 5, 6 months in that cropping process. So we're experimenting with that. What we hate the most about this process is plowing. We hate that we've rebuilt this soil for 5 years, and the first thing we do is turn it on its head at 6 inches deep with a moldboard plow. But you have to do something fairly extensive to stop a sod from growing. If we don't have chemicals to use, you can't just disc it a few times, because grass and alfalfa and clover is just going to keep growing. But what we have had success doing the last few years is grazing it pretty close to the ground in the late fall, early winter, and then rototilling shallowly at 2 inches depth. So basically the rototiller is almost like a burned down herbicide. It's not a complete inversion of the soil profile. We're trying to do it when the soil's cool, so a lot of the biological activity is low and the worms are deeper down in the soil. But we are having success with one pass with a rototiller at a shallow depth, taking the sod out of, killing the sod, taking it out of production. And then finally, again, to avoid this major tillage event, we're experimenting with utilizing some no-till with our bigger seeded crops. We've got a roller crimper, and we're trying to implement the reduced tillage and use a series of winter and summer annuals to soil build, and not the perennials, because it's the perennials that repair the soil, but it's the perennials that require a drastic tillage event in order to stop the perennial growth process. So we're experimenting with utilizing significantly less overall tillage with the roller crimper and cover crops, and using multi-plantings of annuals instead of that perennial. So I think that's all I have. While I can take a couple questions while I get out of screen share.
Yeah, we have a couple here in the chat. One from Michael. Any thoughts as to the perfect or preferred stocking rate and or days on cover crop while mob grazing in the system?
Ask me that again. I can't multitask like you, Brooke.
I can't do it either, John. So just what is your preferred stocking rate? Can you talk a little bit about stocking density in your model, and how many days they're grazing in a certain segment? And obviously that changes throughout the year. But if you can speak to that a little bit.
Yes, so I'd love to talk about this more in the roundtable this evening. Would be a great time. But the real quick, like everything else we do on this farm, diversity. So we don't do any one thing. Basically, depending on how you graze, there's something benefits. And so like for our finishing cattle, the two-year-olds, those things are grazing. We're basically trying to give them ice cream all the time. So they're at a very low stocking rate, and they're trying to allow them to have the top 4 inches of whatever forage is out there and not make them eat too much farther down, because we're trying to get them to grade choice. We're trying to get them to fatten well. But then from an efficiency point of view, for total cows on the farm point of view, we do a lot of take half, leave half, which is kind of maximizes forage production. And so in that scenario, we usually move cattle about every 3 days, twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week. And then the soil building phase is the mob part. And so a lot of times our mama cows, we make them work sometimes. And so they're the ones that have to do the mob grazing, which means they get a lot of good stuff to eat, but they also have a lot of mature, dead, carbonaceous stuff to eat and move fast. And so, and we don't do any one field the same way all the time. We try to add diversity in there. And so we will, like one of the crop fields, we'll graze it one summer 3 or 4 times for, the cattle will be out there 4 or 5 days, and then they get moved and they get over that 4 or 5 times a summer. But then the next year we might mob graze it twice for the entire year, and that's it. So we use the mob grazing to build soil. We use, rotational grazing about every 3 days to kind of be somewhat efficient and have a decent stocking rate for the whole farm. And then we do a little more set grazing or less quick rotations under utilization of forage for the fattening cattle.
Okay, and John, just real quick, because we have this tight time schedule. Sarah Flack asked, what mix of cool season versus warm season perennial pasture species are you including in these acreage that you rotate the annual crops through?
Okay, so the winter time, the cool season annuals is rye, vetch, and winter pea. It's just kind of the go-to, and then we'll if I know it's going to be not a cover crop, but if I'm growing it just to graze, I'll add a little more of the rye in it, and the peas, less vetch, some radishes, some soil building mustards and radishes. Summertime, the quick and easy is corn and soybeans because we had that in the bin, and so it's a cheap cover crop. It's a free cover crop, and they do well. But sun hemp, so a pretty high cocktail mix is when I'm buying the seed. But the go-to or the easy thing to do is cowpeas, soybeans, and actually just bin run corn. That clearly we don't let it, get to maturity, but it's a high carbohydrate, high energy grass or forage that grows fast in the summer, and it's cheap.
Okay, and there's another question about the permanent non-tilled acreage, but we'll hold that until the end. Sound good? Okay, thanks so much, John. Next up is Krista. We'll get her spotlighted. Her slides are ready to go there.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brooke. And thanks, John. First, I just want to say what a privilege it is to present with John and to be part of this conference. I think it's been said before, but I'd be remiss if I didn't say that the Oak team has really thought through every detail, and it's really, I think you all have done about everything as possible to bring us together and build a virtual conference community. So much appreciated. I know it's been said, but I would be remiss if I didn't say it. And it's also my pleasure to be able to talk about the work we've done at John's Family Farm. I cannot thank the Bells enough for their willingness to host their farm as a living laboratory and to be really active participants in their research and for their passion for research and learning. They help us ask better questions that are relevant to the literature and also to the farming community. It's just amazing partners. So John and Mac and everybody just totally go above and beyond. And I'll stop gushing now and get to the guts of the stuff before I make John any more uncomfortable, but we really appreciate you all. So my job here is to take a little deeper dive on some of the mechanisms driving the soil processes that John discussed and kind of describing the Elmwood rotation. So I'm going to talk a little bit from a general theory perspective and then also draw in some of the data that we've taken from various studies. But in doing that, I also want to be mindful that while I think we all really value soil health, and, as being a central tenet in sustaining organic farming systems, we all have varying degrees of interest in the nitty-gritty of soil science and agro-ecosystem processes. So I'm kind of shooting for the middle, and I hope I don't miss both ends, but please ask questions in the chat and happy to follow up in the Q&A or even afterwards. I love talking about this stuff, but I just want to make sure I'm hitting at the right level. So it's kind of a smorgasbord of a bunch of different things here. So with that kind of framing, John covered the importance of perennial roots and the action of root sloughing. So we use the term root sloughing in a couple of ways. So one of that is the action of root exudate. So as roots move their way through the soil is a rough environment. And so they're secreting all kinds of polysaccharides and exudates to kind of grease their way through the soil. And that is a hot spot of biodiversity. We call it the rhizosphere. So that's a huge piece of that carbon input that John talked about. But it's also the concept of sloughing is where those basically where you have a dieback of the root once grazing happens. And so there's not enough photosynthase being sent down to the root system to support that root growth. And that's basically a slug of nutrients and carbon that are being put there right where the soil food web wants it. And we just have an increasing understanding. The science is really emerging in pastures on how grazing and the way that we manage that grazing impacts that. So it makes a huge difference because roots have architecture, right? And the above ground management shapes the below ground architecture. So you can kind of see that from this figure here on how that kind of highlights how the regrowth and grazing pattern of the above ground portion shapes that root architecture. So with this picture of the left, this is tall fescue, and this is courtesy of the Kentucky Natural Resource Conservation Service. So the tall fescue plant on the left was not grazed or clipped at all, okay? And then the plant in the center was clipped once a month at a 3 inches height, kind of simulating rotational grazing. And then the plant on the right was clipped once per week to an inch height, simulating continuous overgrazing. So we can see the effect of letting plants grow up the way that you saw in John's picture. It affects the forage quantity and quality above ground, but it also has effects on the below ground, okay? So really, really important piece. So the thinking about what's going on below ground and how we use the animals to manage that. And as John said, beyond the forage management, a big part of soil building is backing off the disturbance. So much of the literature on this is from conventional corn and bean no-till kind of systems, but the story is the same for us, whether it's organic vegetables production or anything like that. The idea here is that these ecosystem engineers, earthworms, these kind of delicate soil organisms, fungal hyphae, they don't fare very well in tilled systems. And so you kind of see that depicted in the figure on the right. But lesser studied is the role of occasional tillage, like what we see at Elmwood when they can, letting that pasture rest for 5 years, 7 years. We know incorporating sod into the rotation makes a big difference in terms of soil health. But a lot of literature is really like till or no till and nothing in between. But there's starting to be a little bit more research on this. And I like this figure on the left because it kind of touches on that. So what you see here is the ratio of microbial biomass carbon in no-till versus tilled systems. So the relative percentage increase in microbial biomass once the tillage stops. So the biomass increases about 30% from a conventionally tilled system, so a system that gets tilled every year, increases about 30% if you back off the tillage in the short term. So, every other year or every 2 years, it increases about 60% in the medium term. So the 3 to 7 year range, and then about 80% in the long term or 8 to 10 years. So we're really getting about 2/3 the benefit of a continuous no-till system by backing off for just 5 to 7 years. At least that's what these metadata tell us. This comes from a study that studied about 40 different papers in the top 8 inches of soil. So it didn't go all the way down, but it covers a lot of the plow layer. And I just want to do a little aside and talk about what we're using the term soil building, but what do we really mean? Because sometimes when you think about soil building, you're thinking about like building topsoil or building that mineral soil, which is a really long-term process. That's like 1,000 year per inch of topsoil. That's like a biochemical weathering kind of thing. What we're really talking about is increasing the soil organic matter and all of the effects that soil organic matter has on the biological, physical, and chemical properties that on our soils. So this is a really dynamic process with a long timeline, and it requires funneling a bunch of stuff continuously down that pipeline through the soil food web. So we start with those sloughed off or dying portions of the root system or any other residue or biological amendment like manure or cover crop residue or whatever. And as that decomposes, it's going to be worked on by various soil organisms who digest it from they digest whatever they're able to metabolize. It's kind of what their evolutionary strategy is. So they go from the easy to break down stuff, the carbohydrates and the protein, to the more woody stuff, to the stuff that's been chomped on by 10 different soil organisms down the line in front of them. So this is a process that takes really years to decades to transform that carbon into a stabilized or humified organic matter fraction. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about building soil. Okay, and I like this slide because it shows kind of these two different pathways for building soil. One that comes from incorporating residues, and one that, or manures. So for example, the trampling of manure and things like that, like John talked about, and then the role of roots. And so I'll defer to people who are much better forage ecologists or pasture ecologists than I am on kind of the relative importance of these pathways. So don't get too hung up on the numbers, but there's an increasing understanding of the role of root-derived carbon. So from that root sloughing and from those exudates in stabilizing, in providing stabilized a feedstock for stabilized soil organic matter. Some people call this the liquid carbon pathway. So it's basically the stuff that's exuding out of those roots is being put down right in the soil food web. And as John said, you're not tilling it. You're not taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. It's putting it in there right where the microbes are going to start working on it. So there's kind of an increasing understanding of the role of this. Now, that's not to say that tilling in a cover crop and using mulches and those kinds of things is a bad thing. And they're linked, right? I mean, you have the above ground and the below ground portion. But there's an increasing understanding that the roots really play a huge part of it, and the rest plays a really huge part of it. And so also, as John and I talked about this presentation and the tweaks that they're making to their farming system, we talked about me adding a little summary of the literature on what's known about grazing perennial pastures versus a series of annuals, like a succession of cover crops or something like that. And I'll be honest, John and folks who are thinking about this on the really progressive grazing end are way ahead of the scientists on this, near as I can tell. But again, I'll gladly defer to folks who may work in this area more than I do. But anyway, most of this work looking at grazing cover crops or any other series of annuals is really looking at whether the grazing impacts the effects of that cover crop on soil health. So can you get away with grazing it and still get the benefit of the cover crop? That's where the bulk of the literature is. There's very little work directly comparing, quantitatively comparing pastures to annuals in terms of the effects on soil health. So there's some hand waving, and I'm going to continue in that tradition and do some hand waving about kind of the general schools of thought there. So basically, you see from this figure on the right that we find that grazing that annual cover crop is going to get some of that root sloughing effect out of that cover crop. It's going to build that root architecture if it's a grazing tolerant cover crop, it's going to come back. So you're going to get more out of your cover crop if you graze it. But is it going to compare with a pasture? Probably not. Pastures are still, it depends, and there's some things that we can do, but pastures are still considered the gold standard. And primarily that's because of the extensive nature of the root architecture. There's just more roots in a pasture-based system typically. And if you're using tillage to go from one cover crop to another, it's kind of more of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing. But like I said, that's not been studied, and you can do things like John's doing, like backing off the tillage between pieces, thinking about light tillage, not all tillage is a moldboard plow, those kinds of things. So just the nuance there. So again, folks like John are on the kind of the progressive end of this. But that's kind of that we still think of pastures as the gold standard. Maybe 5 years that'll be different with a lot of folks doing these grazing of really heavy and diverse cover crop mixes and things like that. But that's kind of where it stands now. Okay, I'm going to apologize in advance for this slide. It's really awful, but it's important. It's good. I don't have too many of these, promise. But I do want to spend just a couple of minutes taking a pretty deep dive into some of the soil studies that we've done out at Elmwood, and they're really prompted by this question that John has asked me a few times over the years, and that is, how bad are we screwing things up on the vegetable side of the rotation? And I certainly wouldn't say screwing things up, but we know that tillage and cultivation has impacts. So what we see here is basically At the top, greenhouse gas emissions, so carbon dioxide on the left top axis and nitrous oxide, a very potent greenhouse gas on the top right axis. And this is over the course of a 3-year study that we did, and compared some other systems as well, and I'll talk about those. But basically, we see a big pulse of greenhouse gas emissions and nutrient mineralization after that pasture plow event. We expect that. That's where we're getting the nutrients from, right? We're mining that pasture. So that's implicit with the way that the system is set up. But it's a lot. It is a lot compared to some other types of systems. So I'll put it kind of in context with some other studies in a moment. But I just want to point out that pulse of mineral nitrogen and CO2 and nitrous oxide right after the pasture conversion is pretty big. It's hard to tell the magnitude, like what do these numbers even mean? Well, so I'll tell you, basically what they mean is those pulses in the middle that we see, kind of where it says beets and where it says beans, those are kind of on par with what we see in terms of seasonal fluxes in the springtime in other systems. So it's just really that the take home of this is the first year after the pasture conversion, there's a lot of loss, but there's also a lot of mineralization. And that's kind of what we're going for. And I'll kind of talk about how to put this in the context of kind of how do we compare farming systems and their sustainability in a couple of minutes. But it's a really important and critical part of the system at Elmwood. And it's what, it's the natural capital that's being mined to support that vegetable production. But we have good indication that it's getting built back during the pasture process without bringing a bunch of stuff in from off the farm. So a little bit of context there. Okay, so we saw some potentially pretty big loss pathways for nutrients around that time of pasture conversion, but how does it compare with other systems? So this goes back to the original study that we started out with almost 10 years ago now at Elmwood, and comparing 5 different vegetable production systems in a kind of a model of what we would call sustainable intensification. So this idea of how much intensity by way of how we characterize rest periods, how much tillage, where are their nutrients coming from, that kind of thing. How does a low input or an extensive system, so extensive organic is Elmwood on here, compare to other systems? So for example, a medium scale organic system. So this is our University of Kentucky CSA. So this is, we operate a 200 member, 10 to 15 acre CSA. Numbers change a little bit, but we have no animals. It's all annual cover cropping, and we bring in commercial organic fertilizer, mechanically intensive, irrigation intensive, and tillage intensive. So how does that compare to that? A couple high tunnel systems, and maybe less interest to this crowd, a conventional vegetable production system. So we studied the dog out of this. And from everything, looking at leaching, nitrate leaching in the deep profile, greenhouse gas emissions, mineralization all through the soil profile in all of these systems. I'm not going to give you a gnarly graph and put you through that, but I will pull a few highlights out of this. And I'm happy to field questions again. So shooting for the middle, hoping I didn't miss folks on both ends. But basically what we found was that the leaching losses were greatest in the medium scale and organic and conventional systems. So our more input intensive, non-integrated livestock organic system, our CSA, and in our conventional system. Honestly, it probably would have been worse in the high tunnels, but they're undercover. Those are nutrient rich systems, but so less leaching losses. So this is nitrate leaching that would be leaching to groundwater and be lost. So big environmental impact piece that was greatest on those open field systems. There were times that Elmwood had some significant leaching, particularly right after that first spring, but overall lowest losses of all. And that the soil mineral nitrogen levels were lower at Elmwood than in other sites after year 1. So basically we've got some pretty tight nutrient cycles. We may want to try to open up the tap a little bit. They may be a little bit nitrogen limited. And we also found that they came up a little water limited. And I'll talk about that in a sec. And that overall, the greenhouse gas emissions after year 1 were similar to other systems. So kind of how does it compare? After year 1, it pretty much looks like a normal vegetable system. It's just that initial plow down, at least in terms of soil processes. Okay. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to skip this slide and kind of get to what I think is the money shot of this particular presentation. It's kind of putting this all in context. So what is the ecological footprint of all of these systems across the rotation and from everything that's being produced on the farm? So this was a complementary study that we did, the one that I just talked about, where we did a lot of basic nutrient cycling and water process work. And really looked at what is the energy going in and the energy coming out. So this approach is sometimes called a life cycle analysis or an energy returned on energy invested approach. And it's based on calculating the calorie cost or the carbon cost of every single input, from the amount of labor that went into the physical, like into weeding, into planting, those kinds of things, fuel, fertilizer, plastic mulches, all of it, compared to the calories that are produced on the farm from every crop, whether it's kale or a beef product. So in this study, we evaluated those two different organic farming systems, Elmwood as a more low input closed loop system, and a more input intensive model, or UKCSA. And Elmwood's ratios were consistently around 20% of the footprint of a more intensive system. Okay, so they were 20%. So that literally 80% less carbon footprint to produce the same amount of food as a more input intensive system. And it's more of a full diet as well. This is not to like totally trash talk the institution that I work for, but it's just, I think it's really important in thinking about what is the currency that we ought to be looking at? Yes, we can look at greenhouse gas emissions. Yes, we can look at nitrate impact, and all those processes are really important. But when we think about how to holistically evaluate our footprint on the land, I think it's really important to look at energy. Energy is kind of a surrogate. Carbon is kind of a surrogate for energy. So I'm kind of talking in two different currencies today. So soil carbon and energetics. But this is basically showing us that this low input system, that although there are some losses, no system is perfect. When we look at the big picture, we gain a lot out of thinking about livestock integration and the kinds of processes that they're capturing at Elmwood. Just to break some of this down a little bit, what really weights the system towards Elmwood is livestock integration. So those grazers are replacing fossil fuels in their inputs to the soil. They're replacing hay cutting in some cases, and the energy on the back end. So the output, animal products have a higher energy footprint than a lettuce or a kale or something like that. So they're winning on the input side and winning on the output side. So it heavily weighs it. So there's a kind of a systems level effect here. That skews it, but there's a lot to be learned here from this kind of a study. So in terms of next steps and like how we link together the soil process piece with the energy piece, I think what really needs to be done is to compare different types of farming systems, conventional, organic, kind of all across the board, and to be able to do a full carbon budget of all of them. So some way to kind of bring all the pieces together and say, okay, how does the energy that's going into the system relate to the carbon that's being captured in the soil and those kinds of things? And some of those studies have been done. There's been a wonderful study done at Will Harris's place looking at net carbon balance and those kinds of things. There's some really interesting stuff that's being done, particularly in the grazing sector, because some of the heat that beef takes for its impact on the planet in the broader community. So anyway, that's kind of a quick and dirty look at a bunch of data, and I'm happy to take some questions. I'm going to stop the screen share. We had intended for this part to just be, kind of questions for both John and I. So I just assume there's going to be a lot more questions for John than me. So you won't hurt my feelings, is what I'm saying. So fire away.
We have a few questions in the chat. I'm going to go a little bit out of order just so it makes a cohesive kind of narrative. We'll go back to Sarah Flack's original question. For John, what perennial pasture species are in the permanent non-tilled acreage?
So it's predominantly bluegrass, white clover, and or fescue. That's what it wants to go back to. That's, I guess, what's been here the longest. So if you just till it up, you have a bunch of weeds, but that's kind of there's a tendency to want to go to bluegrass, white clover, fescue-ish. So we try to sow, orchard grass or festiolium, red clovers. We're continually frost seeding and drilling, trying to improve the pastures, but its tendency in central Kentucky is either bluegrass or fescue or some combination is kind of the go-to.
Okay, thanks for that. A question from Ben. He says, John, you mentioned fertility and soil biological activity being repaired by the rest period. Were you able to look at soil organic matter? Are you increasing over time, or is it maintaining? So maybe some more details on those, what you're seeing in soil organic matter and other soil test data.
Okay, so Krista can answer the numbers in a second. Because I'm not sure how far back she'll go, but looking at our soil tests, from the last 30 or 40 years, it kind of just maintained for several decades. But in the last, 10 or 12 years that we've been practicing some mob grazing, in the last 20 years that we've quit applying stuff that hinders or knocks down or struggles soil biology. So certain fertilizers, certain pesticides, some of those soil biological disturbing agents that have not been applied in the last 20 years since we've been organic, and mob grazing. Qualitatively, we are seeing significant actual improvement in the soil. Soil test, we're seeing, the numbers changing. It's not going from 3 to 10, but we're seeing everything is going from 3 to 3.5 or 2.5 to 3, where it had been at like 2.5 or 3 for 40, 50 years. We're starting to see it creep up. And the only difference being the occasional mob grazing and the lack of applying murate or herbicides or insecticides or, some things that we know that kind of kill some soil biology.
And that's the soil organic matter that you're seeing creep up.
That we are seeing actually, instead of flatlining for generations, we are seeing start to, it's kind of like looking at COVID tests. It's just the beginning, but you see it turning in the right direction. So we feel like just with a couple of tweaks to the system, we're actually improving the soil rather than just maintaining the soil.
I would just add to that a half percentage in a couple of years is nothing to sneeze at. I mean, the total soil organic matter or percent carbon is it's a very coarse measure. I mean, it's hard to get. That is a hard ball to push up the hill. So if you're seeing that kind of change in a few years, I mean, I don't think you have to equivocate that.
I guess for John and Krista, what's the range that you've seen in Kentucky for soil organic matter on farms?
I think.
Oh, I think it. Go ahead, John.
I would say a lot of anywhere from 1.5 to 3 is probably 90% of what I've seen, at least in central Kentucky. Not that I see a lot of other people's soil tests very often, but generally speaking, that's kind of common. The 1.5 is what's tilled year in and year out. There's a lot of no-till now in Kentucky, so we're seeing organic matter go up, but I'm not sure how much biological activity we're seeing go up. That's, to me, organic or no-till is awesome. Basically, the progressive no-till guys and the progressive organic guys that are all doing a lot of cover cropping and multi-species and intercropping and relay cropping. The only thing that divides us is the organic people have to use a little bit of tillage and the conventional guys have to use a little bit of herbicides, and both of them are destructive. But you get, there's to be so far apart in a certain degree, they're pretty close together. And it's just, that little bit of some type of destructive activity, whether it's in a bottle or some tillage.
Just one quick thing on the organic matter, the carrying capacity, so where you top out, depends on your soil texture. So so Adam Barr talked yesterday about, these 1% or 1.5% organic matter soils in these fragipans and things like that. There's a lot of difference in what the soil type is in terms of where you could realistically end up. And we're blessed in Central Kentucky to be able to build organic matter. Other folks in other parts of the state have more challenging conditions for building organic matter. So there's no magic number.
Right. Okay, so a question from Sean. He says he knows you've had success with the 3 years cropping to 5 years pasture program. Do you think that there's an optimal ratio? Would 2 years cropping and 3 years grazing also perform well? 1 year cropping, 2 years pasture. So what's your thinking about what's next, right? If you were to make suggestions about next step, if you could do all the testing in a different kind of time frame, what would that look like?
So my 2 cents is I didn't plant Sean in the audience there, but it's a great question, because what we were taught by my grandfather was 2 years and 4 years. So I grew up doing 2 years of crops and 4 years of rest. But for me, sitting on hours on end on that mow-bore plow, feeling like I was going backwards from such progress, that we went to the 3 to 5, because basically if I was going to take that huge step backwards, I wanted to get 1 more year cropping out of it. I felt like I was doing such an injustice turning that soil over. Just getting 2 years of crops wasn't worth that damage that I'd done. So that's how we got to 3 and 5. But for generations, it was 2 and 4. I think Krista's, what I've gleaned a little bit of what I understand of all of Krista's study is we're really seeing the soil's running out of gas after 2 years. So that's why I'm growing predominantly legumes or sweet potatoes in that 3rd year. I've also, as I mentioned, I'm introducing a little bit of annual cover crop rest period in the middle of the cropping cycle to kind of put some green nutrients back into the soil. But maybe I should just go back to 2 and 4 years. Maybe that's the right thing to do. I'll have to say with my I feel better about grazing heavy and then rototilling at 2 inches. I feel like that's so much less destructive than the mow-bore plow. I've had 2 winters. This will be the 3rd year that we try it, but I've had real good success of killing the sod that way. And if that's the case, then I could see I would, 2 years and 4 years, or 1 year and let it rest 2 or 3. I would say, Krista, probably your study on the resting, I would think you'd want 3 years of rest. I know that some of the Practical Farm of Iowa studies, they say 2 years of a perennial root is kind of key or vital. So 2 or 3, I think they say 2 years, and your study kind of says stuff is approaching the control in the 3rd year. So something like that.
Yeah.
Well, we are over time. And so I just want to acknowledge a couple comments, and then I really want to encourage folks to continue the conversation with Sarah Flack's session coming up, session 1 and 2 this afternoon, and then come back for the Farmer Roundtable Grazing Management tonight at 5 p.m. Eastern time. But before folks log off, I do want to point your attention to the chat. Matt from Grow Appalachia, who's also doing a session tomorrow in agroforestry. He says that with the farmers they're working back with, they're seeing soil tests come back with organic matter at 1.5 to 3% initially, starting out, but with farms that are doing a good job, adding compost and mulching heavily with rotations, they've seen it go up to 7 to 8%.
Awesome.
And they do awesome work. And let's see, Gail's question. I'm sorry. Statement and question. Gail, I think that if you come back to the Farmer Roundtable and ask that question, we'll have more time to get into it. I think that's going to be the best spot. And then Sean Lucas threw a study in the chat from researchers at Ohio State that put a value on soil carbon accumulation. So that could be an interesting resource too. So that's all we have time for now. John and Krista, thank you so much. I love getting the deep dive and all of the data. It's so good. You make it so accessible. And I think that, you know, with looking at how do we build more climate solutions, we need that data to be able to have a plan, right, that farmers can look to for management practices, right? And how do we value those? And how do we make a transparent process? And I feel like this is really, there's so much more work that needs to be done in this area. And so thank you for being trailblazers here in Kentucky and making it possible and sharing all the details with us.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.